Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is, of course, our Wednesday program. I do that from time to time because after shelter in place, you sometimes forget what day it is. So I just thought at least my public service is it's Wednesday. And this Wednesday, first of all, as you might imagine, we're going to talk about the coronavirus and the pandemic, but we're going to start off talking about some of the models, which turned out to be a lot more art than science. Then look at some of the people that are taking these models, I think, a little too seriously and suggesting that we would have to be actually sheltered in place for 18 months, and some of the questions that need to be asked about that, and even the way in which right now we are crediting or actually recording deaths due to COVID-19. Dr. Deborah Birx explained that, and that was something we already knew, and so we'll get into that. A little bit later, I want to just briefly, I won't spend a lot of time on this, talk about how China was able to get its ideas into press conferences. First of all, there was a pro-Beijing reporter. How did that take place? And then even when you didn't have somebody who was actually working for the communist Chinese, how is it that so many times here you had some of these reporters essentially parroting the line from China? So we'll get into that for a bit. Before this hour is over, I just thought I'd go to our friend Matt Walsh, who's wondering if we've become a police state, and has a lot of good examples, not only of people that are finding themselves, in some cases handcuffed, in other cases fined, but also individuals that are being told they can't even buy certain products on the market, which I think one of the wildest ones I've been able to document is they were told they could not buy mosquito repellent. Okay, does that mean that malaria and West Nile doesn't work anymore and we don't have to worry about that? And so we'll get into some of that. Next hour, when we have the National Hour, I'll come back a little bit more with the Matt Walsh pieces and those kinds of things. Also talk about some of the articles we've posted. Turns out some of these Asian countries that were able to be very successful in fighting the virus now have it rising up again. That's not because they haven't done a good job. It's because people then actually travel to that country. Viruses don't know any difference between borders. And so many of those countries that were our success stories, we're talking about Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, are now facing some problems. So we'll talk about that. And we had a question yesterday about masks. So I went down and dug it out. And it's a lot of science here, so I'm going to try to simplify it as quickly as I can. But I think the conclusions we shared are, of course, the gold standard. The best mask you could have, especially if you're in healthcare, is the N95. But what I think gets missed in all of this, if you go back and look at some of these meta-studies, you will find that actually other kinds of masks are very effective as well. I use the example, and I'll talk more about this next hour. It's sort of good, better, and best. Good is washing your hands. Better is washing your hands and having a mask. Best is actually not only doing all those things, but also working to disinfect the living quarters that you're in, having gloves, having gowns, having eye protection, and all the rest. Okay, so let's let not the best overshadow the good, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's just a brief overview of what we're going to cover. And I might just mention next hour, first of all, we're going to spend some time with Jeff Jerina. His book is entitled Faith Without Fear. He is the founder and also the host of Men Unplugged, and I think you're really going to enjoy his conversation with us. And so we're going to be talking about this in terms of evangelism, but of course we've also talked about how we really should not be afraid. We should not, in a sense, be living in fear, because we are not to be anxious, and God did not give us a spirit of fear. So we're going to be talking about some of that with him, and then we'll have a little bit of a break so I can talk about some of the issues of the pandemic. And then at 2 o'clock, that will be Philip Yancey will be with us, talking about finding God in a time of crisis. Very interesting. Jim Dennison, who will be with us tomorrow, has a very interesting quote or two from a blog he wrote years ago. So I don't expect you to remember everything that he did there, but I was going to use some of that as an illustration. And then also, of course, talk about some of his books, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, Where is God When It Hurts, and a variety of others, just to kind of think about how God might be using this pandemic in a way to advance his kingdom, and how we can think about this, and even how we can deal with the pain and suffering and death. So I think it's going to be a great 3 hours if you can join us for most of that. And I know that many of you are sheltering in place, and you're saying, well, I'm going to work, or I'm going to do housework, or I'm just going to sit and listen to the radio. And so we want to be your lifeline. And as I mentioned that too, we of course had our truth team last week. And so at about 1:30, which again is about an hour and a half from now, we'll be talking with just very briefly Warren Kelly, who's the president of Point of View. He will be and is at our remote studio. And so it gives us a chance to kind of test that out, because there may be a day they have to stick me in a remote studio for one reason or another. And so we wanted to check that out, but also get from him a little bit of an update. And each day it increases in terms of the number of people that have become Truth Team members. I just mentioned those, I think yesterday came from letters in the mail, because some people say, well, I won't put it on my credit card, but I will send you a check. And so if you add that up, we see those numbers increasing. But still, there's a place for you on our website, which says Liberty or Tyranny, join now. And a good number of you have clicked on that button to make a gift. And as I've mentioned before, your gift of even as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, makes you a Truth Team member. And that means you qualify for, of course, the Outlook magazine we send out. We are sending out a copy of Joel Rosenberg's book, A Jerusalem Assassin. Fascinating book, by the way. And then also, of course, the flash drive, which includes, all sorts of great material, about 11 hours of material that we've covered on the program, actual broadcast. And then we also have, I think it's 59 pages of the Outlook magazine, as well as 24 of my Viewpoints commentaries, as well as some great material from the booklets. I think we have a dozen booklets, and so all of those are there. And by the way, if you go to our website today, you're going to see that my Viewpoints commentaries on historical illiteracy and our primary coverage, which is now becoming even less significant. We did have, of course, a primary in Wisconsin, but the news that just came down just less than an hour ago is that Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign, and so we think in some respects, it's over. It was sort of over anyway. Once the switch came from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden did very well, we just knew that over time, Joe Biden would be the presumptive nominee for the Democrat Party. And I guess we can say that with virtual certainty today here on Point of View. But when we come back, I want to talk about some of the modeling. The original model from Imperial College was one that I think was making just some very strong statements and estimates that were not being borne out. But even the so-called Murray model from University of Washington has made some projections that don't seem to work very well, and so we can explain some of that. We also will be hearing from our friend Gary Bauer. I've got some material that he's written here on some of the more positive developments that take place. Then we're going to hear on the opposite side of that from Ezekiel Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is his brother. Ezekiel Emanuel is one of those that was sort of the architect of Obamacare. And he says, we won't have a vaccine for 18 months, so we're just going to have to really just be hunkered down for 18 months. That's not going to work. And then some of the questions that Ben Shapiro is asking, and a variety of other issues that we will get to. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into the coronavirus pandemic and the modeling right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Constitution reminds us that the responsibility for our government rests with we the people. In order for us to be effective, we need to know something about our government and our history. Citizens in countries ruled by dictators don't need to know very much since the major decisions are made for them, but we Americans should be educated and informed. Unfortunately, we are not well educated and informed. A study done by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation discovered that only 1 in 3 Americans could actually pass the U.S. citizenship test, and I might add that you only have to get 60% of the questions right in order to pass the test. For example, a majority did not know how many justices serve on the Supreme Court. Nearly 3/4 could not accurately identify which states comprised the 13 colonies, and only a quarter even knew why the American colonists fought the British in the Revolutionary War. Most disturbing was the fact that young people perform worst on the test. You might excuse an elderly person for forgetting some facts about government or history, but less than 1 in 5 under the age of 45 could pass this test. In previous commentaries, I've proposed a solution that some states have considered. Require students to pass a citizenship test before they graduate from high school. Consider the fact that a naturalized citizen probably knows more about America's history and structure of government than someone who was born in this country. Young people in America cannot pass a citizenship test for one of 2 reasons. Either they weren't paying attention in class or they weren't taught this material in the first place. Let's require students to pass a citizenship test before graduation. We require it of people who want to be American citizens. Why not require it of students who are already citizens because they were born here? I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the criticisms of the press, especially when they have gone to the press conferences that have been daily experience, is, well, apart from the criticism that there seems to be such an emphasis on a gotcha question for the president, is why didn't early on some of the reporters ask, what models are you using? Because in some respects, we have a right to know if indeed these models are making the decision for you or giving you the data that is causing you to close down this country. And if indeed, as you're going to see in just a minute, some people are saying, well, these models will tell us that we have to keep this country closed down for 18 months. I think we have a right to ask that question. And why should also we trust you now that those models turn out to be wrong? They tended to say that there were going to be many more deaths, much more infection than has actually taken place. And of course, if you ask that question, you should expect a reasonable answer. And if you ask that question and you're told, for example, that you don't care about people or you're trading dollars for deaths, or, of course, now since we recognize a high percentage of African Americans are dying from the coronavirus, that you are racist, then you recognize that they really don't have any good answers. So I think it's an important question to ask, and we are getting far past when that question should have been asked a long time ago. But again, the editors of the Wall Street Journal said that, look, modeling the course of the pandemic still may be as much an art as it is a science. The so-called Murray model at the University of Washington predicted that there would be 81,000 fatalities over the next 4 months. which is the same as it forecast 2 weeks ago, but predictions for individual states have shifted. And next hour, when I go into this in more detail, because we have listeners in each one of these states, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, California, whatever, we can give people an estimate on how inaccurate it was. And that's all good news. I mean, I'm not trying to say, oh, it's really bad that this happened. This is wonderful that the predictions were way off the charts and the reality is way beneath the charts. And in just a minute, I'm also going to even raise the question as to whether those listed as COVID-19 deaths really are COVID-19 deaths. But we'll get to that in just a minute. And so they point out that the Murray team has changed their projections somewhat. And in some respects, they said, well, maybe part of the problem in these projections is that the implementation of social distancing at the peak of the epidemic in Italy and Spain might not have been the best ones to use. And of course, we recognize we couldn't trust a lot of what came out of China. So, again, we understand that. And, nobody's pointing fingers saying, you've done the wrong thing. But they also point out that they've had to address all sorts of issues of the prevalence of lung disease, the prevalence of multimorbidity, population density, and all sorts of technical terms I won't get into. And, of course, you also have to recognize something else. New York State is about twice as dense as California. New York City's population is about 300 times more concentrated than the United States as a whole, and 11 times more concentrated than even Los Angeles County. And so it shouldn't surprise us that more than half of the people in New York City also use public transportation, where, of course, you're going to get a higher risk of virus exposure. And then even within New York City, interestingly enough, the coronavirus has hit the Bronx and Queens much harder than Manhattan. And the idea for that is that maybe because you have a lot of multi-generational households, some of whom may have come from places like Italy and Spain, that might explain this, and also could explain why the per capita fatalities in Los Angeles County are much higher than they are in San Francisco. So even ethnic diversity and things like that matter. So I'm the first to admit that models are difficult because the assumptions you make in the models are going to determine your conclusion. And if you make the wrong assumptions, your conclusions aren't going to be accurate as well. But let's just recognize that we have in New York City a 75% drop in hospitalizations. This comes from Gary Bauer. I quoted that yesterday. Governor Andrew Cuomo, governor of the state of New York, has said that New York needed at least 100,000 new hospital beds, but his aides reported yesterday that maybe at most they need 20,000 to 30,000 beds, and that number seems to be going down every day. 4 days ago, Gary Bauer points out that Governor Cuomo warned that he would order the National Guard to seize ventilators anywhere he could find them. Yesterday, he actually said there is no hospital that needs ventilators, that doesn't have ventilators, and so, again, pointed that out. Governor Gavin Newsom in California sent a shockwave through the country when he announced that 56% of his state, more than 25 million people, would be infected in 8 weeks. Of course, that has not turned out as well. And so you can see that a lot of these almost hyperbolic comments and predictions just haven't taken place. So in the midst of this, it was intriguing to me that on MSNBC, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, you might remember that name. He was one of the architects of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. His brother, of course, is Rahm Emanuel, who was, of course, not only chief of staff for Barack Obama, but later, of course, mayor in Chicago and all the rest, said, quote, realistically, COVID-19 will be here for the next 18 months. We will not be able to return to normalcy until we find a vaccine or effective medication. I know that's dreadful news to hear. How are people supposed to find work if this goes on in this form for a year and a half? Of course, it's a good question. Can you answer that, Dr. Emanuel? But he says we cannot return to normal until there's a vaccine. Conferences, concerts, sporting events, religious services, dinner in a restaurant, none of that will resume until we find a vaccine, a treatment, or a cure. And so this is what you're going to be hearing now. I believe in the science, and so the science tells me we have to just keep this lockdown for 18 months. Do you think there's any economy even left after 18 months? And this brings me to another piece by Ben Shapiro saying, really, there's three questions we need to answer. One is, what is the true coronavirus fatality rate? And if you remember our conversation yesterday, we were quoting from Bill Bennett, and it turns out that we do know that number, interestingly enough, but it just doesn't get publicized very often, and you have to dig to find it. Number two, he says, are we expecting a second wave? Because I just mentioned a minute ago, and we'll get into that more detail, some of these countries did have a second wave, but that came from, if nothing else, people traveling to Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, whatever. And then the third question is, what exactly can we do? Are we capable of rolling out tens of millions of tests over the next few months, and then compelling people to take those tests, and then create a contact tracing system for 330 million Americans? And would we even be willing to submit to some of that? So one of the questions that surfaced even yesterday, and it has surfaced more than once, and that is the very significant question, is there a difference between dying from something and dying with something? That's not just a philosophical question, because I think that is one of the reasons why even some of these deaths to COVID-19 might be even higher than some people thought they might be. And that is, let's go back to Dr. Deborah Birx, who I like. So again, I don't want anybody to take me at criticizing these individuals, but she said, she confirmed that all deaths of people infected with coronavirus, regardless of their underlying conditions, are classified as COVID-19 deaths. She even said, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. Tucker Carlson put it this way: it seems entirely possible that doctors are classifying conventional pneumonia deaths as COVID-19 deaths. That would mean this epidemic is being credited for thousands of deaths that would have occurred if the virus never appeared. And it gets back to a fundamental question. There should be, I think, a difference between dying from something and dying with something. And given the fact that it is entirely too easy on a chart to code COVID-19 because the individual tested positive, even if the individual died of renal failure, coronary issues of all sorts, heart attacks, strokes, whatever, you can see that it is at least theoretically possible that indeed that entering that COVID-19 code when recording the cause of death actually makes those numbers look a little bit higher. And so even as we yesterday were quoting from the William Bennett, Seth Leibsom comment, in which they looked up and concluded, looking at the various municipal data portals, that recovery from the coronavirus is at least 98% if you catch it. And it could even be higher now. It's something to put into the mix. It's certainly something to put into the models, and most importantly, something to consider as we go forward and talk about what is our next policy, as in some places in the country, the peak has yet to arrive. In other places, it looks like maybe it is already arrived and may go down. We'll see. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to cover, and I thought I would cover a little bit on how the press is covering this and how some of these pro-communist China comments have surfaced in these press conferences. Where did that come from? We'll talk about that right after this.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. And countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us, and heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just again, as a program note, Jeff Jerina will be with us as we talk about him, host of course, the founder of Men Unplugged, and we'll be talking about his book, Faith Without Fear. Then we'll be talking with Philip Yancey in the next hour, and we'll talk about some of his books, but mostly just kind of focusing on how we can find God in the time of a crisis, and we'll just draw from a number of things that he's written over the years, whether it's some of the blog posts, some of his books on Where is God When It Hurts, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Of course, even as we get to the resurrection, the Jesus I Never Knew, and What's So Amazing About Grace, just some great material we'll get from him. Let me, for just a few minutes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, just point out that we've got a couple of issues to think about in the future. One of those is what has happened to the Asian countries. It's one of the articles I've posted on the website here, because when you started looking at that coronavirus dashboard that many of us have seen from Johns Hopkins, you had some winners out there, and they were Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. They seemed to be the leaders as they saw what was happening in China, and because 2 decades ago they remembered what happened with the SARS epidemic, they jumped into action. And so as a result, they locked down their immigration. They deployed public health workers to follow up contact cases, contact tracing. They got their hospitals shored up. They started publishing clear and very consistent information and data. And guess what? They flattened the curve. And we've used them as some of the best examples. South Korea, one of the best, actually, in terms of even the idea of drive-through testing and all sorts of things. Well, things have come back. Now Hong Kong's had a slow and steady case count going up. You have Singapore's count jump by 47 by March. Taiwan's new cases peaked and then went back up. And then South Korea's had 86 new cases by April 3rd. And so you might say, well, did they not do a good job? No, they did a great job. But guess what? These cases, as they start doing their contact tracing, in many cases, I don't want to overplay this, and you can read the whole article for yourself, came from the outside. And in some respects, the return of the disease partially came after the country eased off measures to combat it. Okay, so part fits there. But that may be more deceiving because, as this article points out, the bad new numbers come from somewhere else, literally, and that is a lesson we might want to learn in terms of the pandemic because, as this article points out, viruses don't know a difference between one border and the next, and these countries are experiencing what could be called re-importation of the disease, infections that are the result of inbound travelers from places that have not been winning their fight against COVID-19. Now, let's recognize the kind of people that go to Singapore may not always be the kind of people that will show up in San Francisco airport or the New York airports of LaGuardia or JF Kennedy, but they might. And so it's just something to pay attention to. And all of it, of course, goes back to China. So I thought I'd spend just a minute or two. I meant to put this one on the website, but you can find it in a number of places, how the pro-Beijing outlet made it into the White House coronavirus press conference. If you're watching these press conferences, and some of you watch them and some of you avoid them, in fact, I've heard from Elisa that sometimes some of you say, I'm only listening to Point of View. I'm not even going to watch even when the press conferences take place. I'm certainly not going to watch the mainstream press. But you have this one individual, which was it's called Phoenix TV, but it means nothing because what it is an organization that has closely aligned with the Communist Party in China. Now, it has a Hong Kong outlet, so it's allowed in, and indeed, this reporter actually has press credentials. And if you watch the press briefing on Monday, she's just asking some really pointed questions. And finally, President Trump, you got to give him credit. I mean, sometimes he's a bull in a china closet. Sometimes he's very difficult to be around, but he's not going to take it for very long. And so finally he said, who are you working for, China? And she says her company is private and based in Hong Kong, which is technically true, but completely misleading. And don't take my word for it. Senator Ted Cruz posted this. In 2018, I warned the Federal Communications Commission about what's called Phoenix TV. It's a misnomer, but that's what it's called, which is supposedly a nominally private company having long financially controlled by China state-owned enterprises. And then Senator Ted Cruz went on to say it's disgraceful and reckless. They have a seat at the White House press briefings as China wages a propaganda campaign to cover up its role in the coronavirus pandemic. So anyway, if you happen to watch that press briefing and wondered who is this woman who's obviously Asian and obviously pro-China, well, that's how that developed, and you can take that up with, was it Jonathan Carl? I think it's the one that works with the press credentials. And so anyway, and you don't always necessarily have to even have somebody who is controlled by the Chinese communists, because our mainstream press does a good job of that. Here's one example that appeared in Red State, and there are others, but this one comes from NBC News. NBC News talks about the fact that the U.S. reported 1,200 coronavirus deaths in 24 hours. Meanwhile, in China, where the pandemic broke out, not a single new coronavirus death was reported. Now, as some of the commentators here in Red State point out, first of all, it came up as an unnecessary cheap shot because, after all, you have to understand that, okay, they had lots of deaths and, matter of fact, have underreported those deaths. And maybe now Wuhan is actually open again. Great. I'm grateful for them and for the loss of life. But also it sounded, as some people pointed out, like a Chinese government-run media account, because even if you assume that China is telling the truth, and I don't, but even if you do, you'd have to say, well, yeah, they went over a peak and now they're on the other side. So it's not exactly comparing apples to apples. And it's just a good example of kind of a gotcha cheap shot that was used as a way to make you people in the United States feel bad because China's doing so much better. And that comes from NBC News. So anyway, I just thought I'd give you that illustration. My first article here on the website today at pointofview.net is by our friend Dennis Prager, in which he says maybe nature shouldn't be worshipped after all. And he and also Ross Dotat, who actually writes for the New York Times, has been on the program as well. Both Dennis Prager and Ross Dotat have been on this program a number of times, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, Dennis Prager says that you think of the old quote by G.K. Chesterton. When people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. And his argument is one of the substitutes gods for people that are secular is nature. And it's not surprising because if you think about that, many religions started out as nature worshiping. And many of those religions before the Bible had kind of nature gods, sun god, moon god, sea god, gods of fertility, on and on. And so the point he makes is that all of us, both left and right, Christian, non-Christian, all sorts of individuals care about the environment. But caring about the environment is not the same, he says, as environmentalism, which has become kind of a secular religion. And if you've ever listened to Point of View for any length of time, Marlon Maddox used to talk about this, and matter of fact, even did a book about this idea of the Gaia hypothesis that comes from James Lovelock back in the 70s. And more recently, James Lovelock actually said, he was honest enough saying environmentalism has become a religion. And so Ross Dotat, of course, writing in the New York Times, even points out that's part of the movies. He talks about the James Cameron blockbuster film Avatar as kind of an apologetic for pantheism, a faith that equates God with nature, calls humanity into religious communion with the natural world. And, of course, he goes on, as he does in the New York Times column, to say, you know, this threat of global warming has kind of almost even developed a cult of nature. And so today there's kind of a, if you will, a nature worship by the pantheist. But there's also, on the people that are the humanist and the atheist, a worship, if you will, of science. Because as what Dennis Prager points out, that when you ask atheists what they believe in, the most common answer is science. And he even points out that in a gym where I work out, if somebody sneezes, instead of somebody saying, God bless you, the atheist there says, science. So if if you sneeze, it goes, science, which is funny. But anyway, and of course, what this is that the idea of Gaia worship is really something that is just completely antithetical to what you find in Genesis chapter 1, which tells us to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, or to have dominion over it. Well, he points out the earth worshipers, they don't like that. First of all, they don't want you to be fruitful. They oppose people having more than one child or even having any child. And then more importantly, they really don't like the idea of ruling over nature, of being a steward over nature. So if nothing else, this pandemic reminds us, as Alfred Tennyson reminds us, that sometimes you have nature red in tooth in claw. Yes, there's some beautiful parts of nature, but you probably don't want to worship nature, and we are facing something from nature that is devastating everybody's life right now. Some are dying, others are out of jobs at the moment. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, I thought I'd just quote briefly from our good friend Matt Walsh, been on the program many times before, and I'll give you a couple of incidents of what has happened for people, in some cases being fined, in one case somebody being handcuffed, and a variety of other issues. And again, let's admit that in light of what I shared yesterday, we're not talking about a shoot-on-sight order like was actually ordered in another country. We have nothing like that. But it brings me back to a conversation that our engineer, Andrew, and I had about what are essential and non-essential products. Now, we've already had this debate about what is essential and non-essential activities, and it always causes a lot of people to roll their eyes that, okay, it's not essential for people to get together at church and worship, but it is essential for us to have the, whatever it is, the cannabis dispensaries open, the liquor stores open, you go down that long list. But there's a bigger issue, and I've started making a short list of all the things that these draconian laws and these almost authoritarian leaders are saying are or not considered to be essential items. And on the second page of this one by Matt Walsh, he points out that now retailers have, for example, forbid and banned the selling of essential items like, here's a good example, mosquito repellent. I love that. I suppose he says the prevention of West Nile and malaria are no longer considered essential. I'll have more to say about this probably in the National Hour, especially for our listeners to American Family Radio, because if you are not familiar, it was a mosquito bite that devastated Don Wildman, who is the founder of AFA, and, of course, his son Tim Wildman now runs that organization. So to say that mosquito repellent is non-essential, I think, is probably one of the most dramatic ones, although I can use many others. But let's move from just the essential, non-essential list to what is happening in terms of what activities are essential or non-essential. The one I heard about a couple of days ago, this one happens out there in Malibu, and a man was out there paddleboarding on the ocean. And it was kind of a joyride, but he was pulled out of the ocean because he was endangering himself. Okay, he's out there in the ocean by himself. Okay, he is certainly not going to contract or spread the coronavirus because he's out there on a wakeboard, but that's enough for them to pull him out of the ocean and hauled him away in handcuffs. I'll give you a couple more examples here. The couple in, I'll use California here, although I need to save some of those for our California listeners when we start next hour. But here's a couple that were in watching the sunset on a beach, and they ticketed them. And I'm not sure, they gave out citations. I don't think they actually got taken off to jail, but that was the case. Of course, a woman in Pennsylvania, I'll do that for our Pennsylvania listeners, was ticketed for simply going out for a drive. That was enough to get a ticket there. Of course, let's use Minnesota here. This one I'd seen before, where this woman was ticketed for two things. Number one, driving with a canceled license. Okay, that seems fair. But second, for violating her state's stay-at-home order. She said she had gone to Taco Bell and before that had visited her storage unit to get some material, but that was enough to get a ticket for two of those. A couple more real quickly. Since I'm in Texas here, let's talk about this. Port Isabel, residents may not travel with more than two people in their vehicles. You're out of luck if you got more than two kids. Sorry about that. It's just incredible. And there are some checkpoints in some of these states where they stop and question people that come there. And if you are a driver from New York and you get caught in Florida, you could face 60 days in jail. And so, of course, there are all sorts of others. And the one I just mentioned yesterday, remember the Benham brothers? Well, one of the Benham brothers was actually arrested for violating the state's stay-at-home orders because he was outside of an abortion clinic. He was exercising social distancing, but now this has become a much more convenient way to arrest a pro-life picketer. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And, of course, you have one prosecutor, and this was in Ohio, that actually on radio said that if you are out of your home, you've actually committed a felonious assault. And if you're guilty, this is his words, not mine, you're going to have to sit your butt in jail and sit there and kill yourself. And so their reaction from some of the people in law enforcement is not typical. We support those of you in law enforcement, but it shows that this has become sort of a pretext for some of this as well. I did post a piece by Victor Davis Hanson as well, Standards for Pessimists and Standards for Optimists. It talks about the Eeyore syndrome. Remember Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh? And the Eeyores right now are allowed to say it's going to be worse and worse and things are terrible. And, of course, if it doesn't turn out, then, well, no big deal. But if it does, they'll say, see, I told you so. But if you're the opposite of an Eeyore and you're an optimist, and things go wrong, then not only are you wrong, but you're culpable. According to the Boston Globe, there's blood on your hands. And so I did mention that yesterday, but I thought we would post it for you to read. And finally, as we get back to changing some of this, we have to recognize there are those who see this crisis as a great opportunity to implement a new world order. And our good friend Pat Buchanan took on the piece that I posted a few days ago by Henry Kissinger, which he points out that Kissinger is talking about the fact that we really need to kind of bring the world leaders together and really begin to address this issue. And Pat Buchanan points out that what I don't see here is the world leaders coming together. And rather, I see sort of every nation for itself, and gives some great examples of that, and even points out that when one leader, that would be President Donald Trump, issued a travel ban on January 31st, it was denounced as hysterical xenophobia and fear-mongering. Now, in hindsight, it looks so good that, guess what? Even Joe Biden now thinks that maybe Trump did the right thing, although he just begrudgingly admits it. And, of course, then Henry Kissinger says we need to struggle to heal the wounds to the world economy. But how can we do that when one of the most significant players in the world economy is communist China, which has, of course, said that they might actually end production of important medicines if we do anything to harm them as a country, and have lied about the extent of the virus and all of the rest. So he points out that in some respects, even though Henry Kissinger is saying this idea of a nation state and a walled city and all that is a legend or an anachronism, he says the real legend, Pat Buchanan says, the myth is the New World Order is the legend, because if nothing else, we're recognizing right now it is pretty much every nation for itself. And so even though there are those who are hoping to pull this together, whether it's the Bill Gates or the Henry Kissingers or all sorts of other people, George Soros, I got a feeling there are a lot of people around the world that are convinced that the answer to our problems with this global pandemic is not a new world order. Although I'll be the first to admit, as we pointed out just a few minutes ago, vaccines and viruses are, again, created by countries. And also, sometimes those viruses don't know the difference between one border and the next. But let's make sure that we certainly encourage those people developing those vaccines in this country, or in places like Israel, the two most vilified countries in the world, which might ultimately save the lives of so many individuals. Let's make sure that they remain strong and provide us with the kind of medicine that we may need in the future. Let's take a break, though. We've got a lot more to cover. Jeff Jerina will be with us. We'll talk about faith without fear, how to share what you believe with confidence and power. Then we'll give you some updates on this whole idea of the coronavirus pandemic. And then in the third hour, we'll have Philip Yancey with us. So we've got a lot to cover. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read some of those articles you just mentioned, then I would encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. If you haven't sent in a donation, could I ask you maybe to do that? Just click on the button. A donation of any size would be appreciated. Just your way of saying, I appreciate what you share every day, and I believe in what you're doing. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. And countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us. And heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for listening to the Wednesday edition of Point of View. We're going to spend some time over the next couple of hours focusing on a number of different topics. Just a minute, we're going to be talking with Jeff Jerina about his new book, Faith Without Fear. I mentioned it yesterday, and we're going to spend a little time there. Then we're going to get into, again, some of the information about the coronavirus, the models, for example, how we're counting some of the deaths from coronavirus. Is it due to coronavirus? In other words, is it death with that or because of that? And so those are issues. Even some wondering if whether or not we're moving into some kind of police state. And so we'll give you some examples of that as well. And so then on the next hour, we'll be talking with our friend Philip Yancey. Of course, we'll be talking about finding God in a time of crisis. We'll talk about some of his books as well that I think impinge upon that. Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, and Where is God When It Hurts? And even as we get closer to Resurrection Sunday, What's So Amazing About Grace and the Jesus I Never Knew. So there's just a lot that we will cover today. And so I hope you'll stay with us for the entire 2 hours as we cover these very important topics. And the first one, of course, is the subject of evangelism. And we are going to now spend some time with Jeff Jerina, who is the founder as well as the host of Men Unplugged. There's a Men Unplugged talk show, which he and a number of leaders talk about practical solutions for the Christian life. His first book, 10 Steps to Power and Purpose. This one, Faith Without Fear, How to Share What You Believe with Confidence and Power. And Jeff, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks so much for having me as a guest on your show. It's a true honor, and I'm looking forward for the opportunity to get to know you and your audience better.
Well, and again, we probably will even cover this even in more detail in the future, but I wanted right now, as people find themselves kind of enclosed, sheltering in place, hunkered down, still there are great opportunities for evangelism, and there are a lot of people asking very important questions about their own mortality and those issues. And as we get closer to Easter, even if that's all going to be virtual, there are a lot of people open to the gospel during Easter. So I wanted to cover this for about a half an hour if we could, and mention that in the book, which we have a link to, and also a link to your website, about 10 chapters, great material, and then 11 lessons. And this really comes from one of the evangelism courses you taught many years ago, didn't it?
Yes, sir. And by the way, Kerby, thanks so much for saying those kind words. I really do appreciate that, because one of the courses I took in seminary, I had to write this one particular paper. I actually used one of your books. I quoted from that, one of your great books, and so I appreciate that. But yeah, this book came about from a course I developed about 8 years ago, or back in 2008, and really it just came out of my own struggles, Kerby, to share my faith. I just, I came to know Christ back in 2001, and I was so zealous for what Christ did for me, Kerby. I mean, he just radically transformed my life, turned it around for better, and you, obviously, we all know that that's what he does. But I was so happy to tell people about what Jesus did for me, yet when I would tell them about how he saved my life, physically and spiritually, I just kind of left them hanging, Kerby. And I think a lot of us as believers, we do that to where we're so excited to tell them about Jesus, but yet we don't know how to share our faith.
Oh, sure.
And so I was just stuck with giving them this greatest gift. Like I said, look, here's where the greatest treasure is. You can have it for free, but I never gave them the map because I didn't know how to share my faith. And that's really how this book came about.
Well, and again, I would encourage people to go to our website. First of all, we have a link to menunplugged.net, but also we have a link to faithwithoutfearbook.com. We figured that people would want to order it from you because there's a discount on the book, and there's a video that I would encourage people to watch because that video explains kind of what the book is and what it isn't, and you do a real good job of explaining that. But let's get into this because you're not the only one. You have a quote early on from Bill Bright. We all remember him from Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Cru, in which he estimated maybe only 2% of Christians were actively sharing their faith. Now, we've had some other people on the program that doubt those numbers. Matter of fact, at Probe Ministries, we did probably the most extensive survey of born-again millennials and found that that is at least 100% higher. At best, we couldn't even come up with more than about 1% of millennials that share their faith. And oftentimes when you ask them how they share their faith, they say, well, I told people I go to church, which is not exactly the gospel. So you have a work to do here. So this is one of the reasons why this book is so helpful. And the way you've written it is that, first of all, you have a section, a game plan, discussion questions, some challenge, and then you actually have a course. So for our listeners out right now that may be pastors, Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, they can take this book and they can instantaneously put together an evangelism course, can't they?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you said that because part of what the book does is it doesn't just give you the step-by-step game plan, what I call the ultimate strategy for sharing your faith. What it does is it helps to change the mindset, or what we would say the heart set about evangelism. I think, and if I go too long, Kerby, please let me know and I answer, and I'll promptly stop answering. But I think a lot of times what we think why we don't share our faith is because we have some fear. We're afraid of being rejected. We're afraid that we're not going to know enough. We're afraid that, someone's going to ask us a question that, hey, we don't know where to steer them, or we're afraid of being persecuted, right? We have all these different fears, and I had all these fears and more back in 2001. But as I started to ask questions, ask other believers, and ask pastors, I went to a lot of churches, Kerby, and I started asking them, what is your game plan for evangelism? How often have you shared your faith with somebody else? How often have you shared the gospel with somebody? Almost indefinitely, almost all the time, the answer I got back was, we hardly do that. We don't do that because we don't know how to share our faith.
Of course.
And so really the answer here is when somebody says they have fear for not sharing the gospel, to me those are just symptoms of a bigger root cause. And the root cause here is because no one is learning how to share their faith. But we have to flip that coin, Kerby, and say the reason why we're not learning to share our faith is because we're not being taught. And I'm not trying to say this in a bad way to call out the church. That's not what I want to do. I want to encourage and equip every believer, every individual that's listening, that they can easily share the gospel, okay? Regardless of your age, your spiritual gift, your vocation, whatever that is, all it takes is preparation. And Kerby, in 1 Peter 3:15, that we're to always be ready to give an accurate defense. And I tell people that you cannot defend your faith unless you first know how to share it. It's like if you defend first without knowing how to share it, it's like putting the cart before the horse. It just doesn't work. So to your point, yes, we do have the course. We have the book. And, I have in multiple chapters in the book discussion questions, a game plan session, personal challenge questions that you can do alone with your small group at your church. So right away, you can go in there with, I have testimonies, how I've used this particular method to share my faith and people have come to know Christ. But I also have a story in there, Kerby, where I shared my faith with somebody. It was on the beach. If you remember the story, they were in Santa Rosa, Florida.
Let me jump in real quickly because I want you to tell the story, but I have one of those mandatory breaks. So we'll come back to the beach and then talk about some of the great material in this book right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Constitution reminds us that the responsibility for our government rests with we the people. In order for us to be effective, we need to know something about our government and our history. Citizens in countries ruled by dictators don't need to know very much since the major decisions are made for them, but we Americans should be educated and informed. Unfortunately, we are not well educated and informed. A study done by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation discovered that only 1 in 3 Americans could actually pass the U.S. citizenship test, and I might add that you only have to get 60% of the questions right in order to pass the test. For example, a majority did not know how many justices serve on the Supreme Court. Nearly 3/4 could not accurately identify which states comprised the 13 colonies, and only a quarter even knew why the American colonists fought the British in the Revolutionary War. Most disturbing was the fact that young people perform worst on the test. You might excuse an elderly person for forgetting some facts about government or history, but less than 1 in 5 under the age of 45 could pass this test. In previous commentaries, I've proposed a solution that some states have considered. Require students to pass a citizenship test before they graduate from high school. Consider the fact that a naturalized citizen probably knows more about America's history and structure of government than someone who was born in this country. Young people in America cannot pass a citizenship test for one of 2 reasons. Either they weren't paying attention in class or they weren't taught this material in the first place. Let's require students to pass a citizenship test before graduation. We require it of people who want to be American citizens. Why not require it of students who are already citizens because they were born here? I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Folks, have Jeff Jerina with us today. And again, we wanted to do this before Easter, before Resurrection Sunday, because I think there are just going to be some great opportunities for you to share your faith, but most importantly, just to encourage you to do so. Let me just mention that we also have a couple of links. First of all, to menunplugged.net, and I would suggest that you go there, men, especially to find out more about the talk show and some of the material that is available to really help men and their families. And then, of course, we have a link to faithwithoutfearbook.com. And Jeff, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were telling a story on a beach and your evangelistic experience, so please continue.
No, that's okay. That was a good break. Man, who likes to interrupt a story about a beach, right? No, what I was just saying is that one of the stories in there is a story where I had a chance to share the gospel to an individual that he actually was. I was just praying one day. Okay, Kerby, I was just praying one morning. I went to the beach, loved the beach, and I was out there about 6:37 in the morning, and I was like, Lord, who do I need to speak to today that needs to hear the gospel message? And then within about 2 minutes, okay, you know, this is how the Lord works. It's just crazy. So right behind me, there was this gentleman that started putting up beach umbrellas. Long story short, I found out that he owned a rental company, beach rental company. Went out there, and I said, hey, I shared my testimony with him, and I said, would you like to know how you can be sure that when you die, you go to heaven? And he said, well, not really. I'm working. And I said, this is what I said, Kerby. I said, look, you and me are on the beach. We're the only ones here. And if I could help you for free, put these umbrellas and these beach chairs up, would you be willing to at least hear me out? He said, for free? I said, yeah. So he listened to me.
So good.
I worked for free. Now I'm on the beach now, so I wasn't complaining, sharing the gospel with him. But here's the deal. He did not place his faith in Christ. And I share that story in the book because I want everybody to understand, this is something I had to understand, is that not every witnessing opportunity leads to a faith-based decision. And that's okay, because our part is not to win people to Christ. Our part is just to be prepared, being faithful to share what Jesus has done for us. That's our part.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because a lot of people might say, well, okay, what's God's part and what's my part? Because it's sort of hard to figure out. And there are times when you have individuals that ask very leading questions. We, years ago at Pro Ministries, used to speak on college campuses. And I remember one time one of our speakers finished a presentation, and the professor, who was an atheist, was saying, you've been talking about this born again thing, and I'm an atheist, but I think maybe some of our listeners and some of our students and some of the people here would want to maybe know when you had that experience, how you had that experience, and if it's made any appreciable difference in your life. Those are times I just say, Lord, thank you so much. But most of these evangelistic opportunities require us to have a little bit of spiritual discernment. We might be talking about bread. We might be talking about sports teams. We might be talking about the pandemic. But there are real opportunities, if you're even slightly creative, to turn that into a gospel presentation. But then what's our responsibility and what's God's responsibility?
Man, I like the way you lead into that, because right now with this unfortunate pandemic that we're a part of, it has hit everybody in one way, shape, or form across the globe. That's just the truth of the reality of the situation. But I think right now this is a great opportunity, even though we have the social distancing and we can't be around people. Think about social media. Think about the impact here that you can share your testimony. You can share what God's doing right now for you and your family. You can be sharing that with others. And I know that's not your question, but to me, this is a great opportunity. So I would say this. I teach in the book here that our part, as I mentioned earlier, is just to be prepared. That's all we need to do. Now, being prepared is you need to get something like Faith Without Fear. You have to get that book to understand what it is or how to share your faith, right? A simple step-by-step guide. And what I say here, Kerby, is I really want people to understand that you don't have to use that method. I just say this. If you have some method, you have some template that you understand what scripture verses are that you need to go to, that the ones that you really need to get across, you need to have something so you're not tripping up over your words, so that when an individual asks you a question like, hey, well, what about this? What about that? You're not always responding to the questions right away. You can respond with this. That's a great point. I used to have the same question, or I used to have a question similar to that. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to finish what I was sharing. It may alleviate or remediate those questions. Because what does the enemy want to do? Kerby, the enemy, the devil, does not want us to share the gospel. And so that individual sharing that's an obstacle that we have to overcome. And the way to do that is just by quickly getting back to Scripture. So our part is to be prepared. The Lord's part, the Holy Spirit's part, I say it's two parts. The first part is to prepare us, okay? It's to, I'm tripping up on words. The Holy Spirit's part is to empower believers to share the gospel. And the second part of that is to win others to Christ. So if you think about that, we have no hard part. We're off the hook. The Lord has the hardest part. He has to empower us, and secondly, he has to win somebody to Christ. Our part is just to be ready to share what Jesus did in our life. It's like this. You buy a new product on Amazon, you love it. All you have to do is you tell everybody about this product, how good it was. That's all your job is.
That takes a lot of pressure off, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to, before we run out of time here, mention that we do have faithwithoutfearbook.com, and there are a couple of things. First of all, there's a video, which I would encourage everybody to watch because it just gives you an idea of some of the things you've talked about. You are very generous to make a discounted copy of the book available, which, by the way, the foreword is by Josh McDowell. The endorsements by people that have been on this program so many times before, like Gary Thomas and Steve Arterburn and a variety of others that you would certainly know. And so if you find yourself wanting to get a copy of that book, or for some of you that maybe have a small group or a Bible fellowship, maybe you'd like to actually convene a class to encourage people to be more effective in evangelism, there are just the 11 different sessions in the back half of the book, back two-thirds of the book almost, that actually take you through the role of evangelism, the steps to witnessing, sharing your testimony, even assurance of salvation, dealing, as you just said a minute ago, with objections. And then if that's not enough, there's, again, 4 different appendices there that just help you kind of walk your way through that. So, again, all of that's available at the website that we have, yourpointofview.net, or just go to faithwithoutfearbook.com. But you also have a contact point, because I know right now we're all sheltered and we're all locked down, but there's going to be a time when that's going to open up. And I got a feeling, Jeff, there are some pastors right now that are saying, would you be willing to come to my church and maybe lead a session or kick this off? I'll be glad to go after you start giving the presentation, and we'll take the lessons after that. But you're available to go and speak and to do training as well, aren't you?
Amen. Yes, sir, I am. I mean, anytime, I'm welcome to give a keynote, a sermon, and just like you said, group training at churches, whatever that is. And to your point there, one of the chapters at the back of the book is how to create a culture of evangelism in your church.
And I think if nothing else, a lot of pastors right now say, okay, I'm convicted. We need to do this. We recognize very few people, even in my own church, are sharing their faith. This is such a great opportunity as we get closer to Easter. And even although we're sheltering right now, there's still a lot you can do in social media. And that's going to change. And then we're going to have a chance to come out there. And a lot of people are going to be thinking about their own mortality as they've seen the death counts. And so I just think this is a ideal time. We're starting to see a lot of people suggesting maybe we're in the midst of some kind of spiritual revival, but that takes place because, if nothing else, we're willing to pray and then to go. So if nothing else, I wanted people to know about menunplug.net. Because that's a great resource for anybody that wants to know more about how to encourage men, and also wanted them to find the link to faithwithoutfearbook.com. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us. We'll do this again, but I just wanted to use this as a motivation as we get closer to Easter.
Kerby, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And by the way, can I get you on as a guest on the show?
Yeah, I guess I could do that. That's a turnabout is fair play, so we'll see if we can do that.
Yeah.
We need to take a break, though, and when we come back, just real briefly, we're going to talk with Warren Kelly, who's the president of Point of View. Some of you have said, okay, how did you do last week with your truth team? So he'll talk with us just briefly, give us an update. Then we'll get into some of the questions about the coronavirus pandemic. That's going to be an important issue, and we have posted many of those articles on our website, pointofview.net. If you find yourself wanting to get a hold of Jeff, well, just simply go to Point of View, because we have those links on our website as well. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. And countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us, and heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero.
Point of View will continue after this. You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in just a few minutes. We're going to be talking about the coronavirus modeling and some of the numbers and a variety of other things. But some of you were wondering, since last week was our Truth Team week, how did we do? And, of course, we still have a few checks that are coming in the mail, but I thought we would bring to the microphone from our remote studio Warren Kelly, who is the president of Point of View. So, Warren, how did we do last week?
Oh, Kerby, it was a great week. What a great lineup of guests you had all week, great interviews. And, you know, we were kind of surprised. We didn't really know what to expect when we began the week. So many people are going through difficult times right now. There's so much uncertainty. We just weren't sure how people were going to respond. So we adjusted our goal for the week, set our goal, and thought we were kind of stepping out a little bit in faith and being a little aggressive. And the audience just surprised us, and we blew right past that goal by almost 20%. And we are just so thankful for all the response from people. Obviously, it was down a little bit from what previous weeks have been, but we were just so pleased, so excited to have so many people that have participated and been a part of this.
Yes. And as I understand, of course, we did set a lower goal. So just to meet our needs, sometimes we also like to remind people that we still are listener supported. And I would still love to have people join with us at the Truth Team level, because if nothing else, we'd love to send them, of course, the Outlook magazine, the Joe Rosenberg book, but especially one of the things that we've featured over the last week or so is this flash drive that just has all sorts of great interviews, some of the best interviews we have, almost 11 hours on that flash drive, as well as I think it's like 59 pages of articles and things that were in Outlook magazine, 24 of my viewpoint commentaries, and a dozen of those booklets that we make available to people who give it a larger amount. So you're still getting a few small donations and a few larger donations coming in the mail, so we can give a final total, but if nothing else, that's good news. So what would you suggest if somebody still wants to join with us here for Truth Team?
Oh, if you didn't get a chance to respond or participate last week, let me encourage you to do so. As Kerby mentioned, that flash drive and the content on that is just phenomenal. One of the best products I think we've ever put together. So let me encourage you. You can either go to pointofview.net, and there's a place where you can sign up there, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net or 1-800-347-5151.
Warren Kelly, if nothing else, I was glad to see that our remote studio is working, because I may need to use that someday myself. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Let's, if we can, get into a couple of issues real quickly, and that is, of course, the modeling, because let's face it, if you look at the Johns Hopkins map right now, I'm looking at it at the moment, it shows that 315,000 people have recovered from the coronavirus. But again, what about some of the other people that have died, and what about some of the estimates of what this will mean in the future? So one of the articles that came out here talks about the fact that, of course, modeling is still more of an art than a science, and the Murray model, which is, I think, one that has not made such dramatic predictions like the Imperial College model. Murray model comes out of University of Washington. Nevertheless, even that one overestimated the various people that would die, which I think is incredible good news. And since we broadcast around the country, let me just point out that the predictions were 80% lower in North Carolina, 75% lower in Pennsylvania, 70% lower in California, 65% lower in Texas, 55% lower in the state of Washington. And even when you look at some of the hot spots like Louisiana, still it was about 2/3 lower than what was predicted. And you do have a few places, especially in New York and New Jersey, where that has not been the case. And so a lot of people said, why is it these predictions aren't necessarily accurate? And the team points out that in some respects, they couldn't necessarily trust all the information coming out of Wuhan, China, of course. But even when they looked at what was happening in Italy and Spain, that probably didn't give them the best look. And the reality is that even as you look at the various states, there's a difference even there. For example, New York State is about twice as dense as California. New York City's population is 300 times more concentrated than what you find in the United States, 11 times more concentrated than what you see in Los Angeles. And, of course, you have to recognize, of course, in New York City, about half the people use public transportation, which sadly, if you've seen those pictures, illustrates how people would have a higher risk of exposure to the virus. But even within New York City, the coronavirus has hit, say, the Bronx and West Queens much harder than it has Manhattan. Some have said, well, maybe that's because you have more multi-generational households and more ethnic households from maybe even some that have come from Italy and Spain, which they're thinking might even explain why the per capita fatalities are much higher, say, in Los Angeles County than it is in San Francisco. So I'll be the first to admit that I'm not casting any blame on these predictions, but they have been much higher than people predicted. And that's good news that we don't have the loss of life that some people feared. And some people might say, well, that's due to social distancing. No, these models had baked into them an assumption about social distancing. But there is something else that has surfaced, and it surfaced because of something that was said by Dr. Deborah Birx, who, again, I don't want you to think that I'm being critical of her. I think she's done a very good job. But she confirmed the other day that all deaths of people that were infected with the coronavirus are listed as COVID-19 deaths. She said, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. So if an individual dies of anything, but they also had tested positive for COVID-19, it's listed as a COVID-19 death. Tucker Carlson put it this way: it seems entirely possible that doctors are classifying conventional pneumonia deaths as COVID-19 deaths. That would mean this epidemic is being credited for thousands of deaths that would have occurred if the virus never appeared in the first place. And it brings us back to kind of an important kind of philosophical question. Is there a difference between dying from something and dying with something? And I'm not necessarily just playing with prepositions here, because if you died from something like pneumonia and you had the coronavirus, maybe it was a contributing factor, but maybe not. If you have cardiac arrest, was that brought on by COVID-19 or not? So there is, I think, a difference between, quote, dying from something and dying with something. And so as a result, it's also of concern that if we're going to use the models, we need to have a better definition of why a person died in the first place. And this all matters because a lot of you are starting to ask this question, and you will see some of my commentaries that come out next week asking, where do we go from here? Well, just the other day, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel was on MSNBC, and if that name is familiar, he was one of the architects of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. If that last name sounds familiar, yes, he is the brother of Rahm Emanuel. But anyway, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel was pointing out that he says, realistically, COVID-19 will be here for the next 18 months or more. We'll not be able to return to normalcy until we find a vaccine or effective medications. Then he went on to say, well, I know that's dreadful news to hear. How are people supposed to work if this goes on in some form for a year and a half? A good question, by the way. So he ends by making the statement, we cannot return to normal until there's a vaccine. Conferences, concerts, reporting events, religious services, dinner in a restaurant, none of that will resume until we find a vaccine, a treatment, or a cure. And I think at this point we have to say, look, doctors, virologists, epidemiologists are obviously concerned with the physical health of human beings, but economists and policy leaders and politicians and government leaders also have to be concerned with the physical and economic health of a country as well. And I think it is reasonable to ask, given the fact that these models aren't as accurate as we expected, and some of those models might be used to determine what we do in the future, we need to be asking some questions. How certain are you of some of these models, and how certain are you of what actually could transpire in the future? And if instead we're greeted by people that roll their eyes like, I can't believe you asked that question, or people who suggest that you're trading dollars for deaths, or that now because we've found that a high percentage of African Americans seem to be disproportionately die from COVID-19, that's a racist comment or whatever. And there's never just a kind of an honest discussion and debate and understanding of where we go in the future, I think you'll have your answer. And so there's, in some respects, a real concern. And a second one has to do with, as we'll talk about after the break, one of the articles I've posted, these Asian countries that have actually been so successful in dealing with COVID-19 now look like they might have to do it again. And that's because even though they did a good job, you now have kind of the re-importation of the disease as they allowed people to travel to that country. And so we'll talk about what that might mean. Also a piece on maybe nature shouldn't be worshipped after all. Piece by Dennis Prager. Also a quote from Russ Dutot. So we've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just as I mentioned a minute ago, if indeed some of these COVID-19 deaths are not necessarily due to COVID-19, but are individuals that died of something else with that virus, that's something to think about, because if you remember yesterday, we quoted rather extensively from this piece by William Bennett and Seth Leibsohn pointing out that as they dug into the municipal data portals that they could find the information, they said that they estimated your chances of recovery from the coronavirus were at, 98% if you catch it in the first place. Now, if indeed some of those are maybe inflating numbers, that might not be 98%, it might be 99%. But again, we'll cover that maybe in a future program, because on the other side, you've got to say, if not only we remove some of the restrictions, what about allowing people to travel to this country? And what has happened right now to Asian countries that actually were very successful in flattening the curve are starting to see that curve go back up. And I'm talking about, if you've ever looked at the dashboard tracking, you'd see that Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea actually seem to do pretty well. Now, I think they remembered from the SARS epidemic 2 decades ago what happened. So they locked down their immigration. They deployed public health workers to follow up on contact cases and doing contact tracing. They got their hospitals shored up, and they began publishing clear and consistent information, and they flattened the curve before many of us even thought about flattening a curve. But now, sadly, some of those numbers are starting to increase. Hong Kong's went up in March. Singapore's count went up in March. You also saw Taiwan's even go up a little bit in late January. South Korea's began to go up in April. And part of that could be, of course, due to actually releasing some and easing off some of the measures to combat it. But according to this article we've posted from Wired magazine, it looks like the bad new numbers come from somewhere else. And that is that it's, in a sense, a lesson for us maybe to learn. And that is, viruses don't know what a border is. So these countries seem to be experiencing an increase due to what you might call a re-importation of the disease, infections that came from inbound travelers from other places that haven't been so successful in fighting COVID-19. So you'll have to think through that implication as well, and it's a relative one to talk about. But how do we think about this from a Christian point of view? And I thought this piece by Dennis Prager, which is the first article we've posted, is very good. Dennis Prager's been in the studio with us before and looks at this from a Judeo-Christian point of view, actually a Jewish point of view, because he's even got a commentary on the book of Genesis. He also quotes from the New York columnist Russ Dutat, who actually has been on the program, who's a Christian. And he points out that G.K. Chesterton's favorite line was, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And one of those substitutes has been nature. You know, you have, even in these pagan religions, had nature gods, the sun god, the moon god, the god of the sea, the gods of fertility. And some of the people in the environmental movement actually have made it into a religion. Now, he says, you know, let's face it, left and right both care about the environment, but he's talking about environmentalism. And there was a phrase that was coined years ago by James Lovelock called the Gaia hypothesis. And interesting enough, James Lovelock more recently even said environmentalism has become a religion. Now, some of you that have listened to Point of View for some length of time remember the original host of Point of View, Marlon Maddox. He had a book that came out called The Seal of Gaia. And so you have, first of all, this kind of pantheistic idea that people adopt. And he quotes from New York Times columnist Russ Dutat, who reminds us that James Cameron's film Avatar was an attempt to kind of become an apologetic for pantheism, a faith that equates God with nature, calls us to be in communion with the natural world. But that fits kind of the pantheist. Well, what about the atheist or the humanist? Well, if you ask those individuals, well, they say, I believe in science. And as a matter of fact, one of the things Dennis Prager has said is kind of the new God for people that are secular is science. He even tells a funny story about a young man who's an atheist who works out in a gym where he works out, who when somebody sneezes, instead of saying, God bless you, he says science. So if somebody sneezes, he says science, which I thought was kind of interesting. But, you know, you've got to understand right now that especially with this kind of Gaia worshiping world, they have real problems with a Christian perspective, because Genesis 1 and 2, but especially Genesis 1, tells us that we are to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, or some translations say have dominion over it. Well, that's not exactly what your earth worshipers like, because, first of all, they don't want you to be fruitful. They're opposed to people having more than one child. Matter of fact, some of them even are talking about zero or negative population growth. So they really aren't advocating that you become fruitful. And they really have a problem over the second one, that is to be a steward, to have dominion over nature. And yet what this has done, I think, is remind us that certainly there are aspects of nature that are beautiful and awe-inspiring. If you come into my office at home, I've got some of the pictures I've taken over the last many decades of some of the most beautiful places on earth. I love landscape photography, but nature is also brutal and merciless. Remember what Alfred Tennyson said? It's nature red in tooth and claw. Nature has no moral rules, no compassion. And, of course, even our new atheists talk about we just dance to DNA. And so in some respects, this is a very important issue that we need to address. And I've also posted a very good piece that I quoted from yesterday by Victor Davis Hanson called The Eeyore Syndrome, and you can read that as well. But I thought I'd end this segment by just quoting from our friend Matt Walsh, because he has pointed out that we are starting to live in what looks like a police state. Coronavirus has been used as a justification to clamp down on individuals, and now we're even seeing them banning essential items like mosquito repellent. I love his line, I suppose the prevention of West Nile and malaria are no longer considered essential. And for our listeners on American Family Radio, you might even remember that the founder of AFA, American Family Association, Don Wildman, it was a mosquito bite that caused him so much health reversal. And so now when they're saying, we can't even sell mosquito repellent or all sorts of other products, something is seriously wrong. And for our listeners out there in California, it has been amazing, because you had one man that was out there paddleboarding in the ocean, and he wasn't spreading the coronavirus or even getting it in any kind of contact, but he was pulled out of the ocean and hauled away in handcuffs. For our listeners in San Diego, there were people that were watching a sunset on the beach and were giving out citations. For our listeners up there in the Midwest, you have this one woman who was pulled over and ticketed for 2 offenses. One, a canceled license. Okay, that seems fair. But the second one was for violating her state's stay-at-home order. She had gone to Taco Bell and had visited a storage unit, and that was enough for her to get a ticket. And more importantly, as I've pointed out for some of you, if you know the Benham brothers, one of the Benham brothers was actually cited for being arrested for violating the state's stay-at-home orders because of a protest outside of abortion clinics. And so we have now pro-life protesters in California and North Carolina that have been arrested for violating stay-at-home orders, just using as another weapon against some of us. So these things we're going to have to pay attention to, and we will here at Point of View. We come back, though, we want to spend some time talking with our good friend Philip Yancey. Can we find God in the time of crisis? How do we think about this biblically? And maybe we can benefit from some of the things he's written in both his blogs and his book. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. And countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us, and heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Philip Yancey about finding God in a time of crisis. As a program note, I might just mention this time tomorrow we're going to have with us Dr. Jim Dennison. Of course, he's been with us so many times before, and he has this daily article that he posts. And at one point, he quotes from Philip Yancey, saying in one of the blog posts by Philip Yancey, well, it goes back a couple years, that God goes where he's wanted. And it was just a fascinating blog post, which we might get to a little bit later. And I thought it was kind of interesting to see him quoting an individual that we have a chance to talk with right now. Philip Yancey, of course, has served as the editor-at-large for Christianity Today, written more than 24 books, and of course you are familiar with some of those, like Disappointment with God, Where is God When It Hurts, What's So Amazing About Grace, The Jesus I Never Knew. And a matter of fact, the last time we were with him, we talked about Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, updated and combined edition that he did with Dr. Paul Brand. And so, Philip Yancey, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
You know, one of the things that I found as I was looking through some of the material from that book is you were talking about how Dr. Paul Brand has influenced you perhaps as much as anyone. And you said, we need heroes of medicine and faith in these divisive times. Okay, that was written months ago. And
right.
Yet, how true is that now in the midst of that pandemic? I'd love to get your thoughts.
It sure is. One of the people I pray for every day is Dr. Francis Collins, who's head of the National Institutes of Health.
Yes.
Now, the one we often see on the news is Dr. Fauci, of course, who's a star in his own right. He actually reports to Francis Collins, and I pray for these guys. They were put in one of the trickiest positions you can be in, because you've got the pressures of the government trying to get things back to normal as fast as possible, and then you've got the pressures of the scientists saying, wait a minute, let's not move too fast. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. And then the American public, who's afraid and wants some honest talk, and they're doing a pretty good job. But boy, that's a tricky post to be in.
I would not want to trade our lives for that at all, because as we pointed out even in the hour before you joined us here, that you have to recognize that some of the models have predicted dire circumstances, and as bad as it's been, it's nothing like what was predicted, and that's good. But then a lot of people are saying, where do we go from here, and what can be done, and how do you begin to even think about this, given the fact that some people will say the moment you start talking about that, well, you're trying to trade dollars for deaths. No, but I'm just trying to recognize that there are a lot of individuals right now who I run into all the time that have no jobs, no income, and no opportunity to support themselves. And so you're just trying to figure out how to craft all of that. So that is, of course, one issue. And as you point out, epidemiologists and virologists have to think about that. Then economists and political leaders do. And if nothing else, it makes me want to just pray for anybody that I can think of, people on the front line in the medical profession, people that we are to pray for, as we're told in 1 Timothy 2, those in positions of leadership and authority. And so if nothing else, that's kind of where we find ourselves here in the 21st century.
You're absolutely right. And it's easy to lose track of what suffering does to individual people. You know, we look at these charts, and today they're announcing, oh, it may not be so bad. There may only be 140,000 deaths, not 200,000. You say, oh, well, that's good. But it doesn't hit individual people like a statistic. It hits them 100%. Yes. So these families, you know, we see these wrenching stories of somebody who goes to the doctor and they're put in the hospital, and they're there for a week and moved to intensive care, and they die, never seeing their family members again. And we understand why that's necessary for protection and contamination and all that, but what a tragedy that something that tumultuous would happen, and you have no warning, no preparation, no saying goodbyes even to the people you love. We need to keep those people in mind as well, just bearing up. I remember one of the lessons that Dr. Brand told me was, a healthy body is not a body that feels no pain. He could say that because he worked with leprosy, and he was the one who discovered that the damage in leprosy comes because people don't feel pain, so they literally destroy themselves. He says a healthy body is not one that feels no pain. It's one that attends to the pain of the weakest part. And as Christians, that's one thing we can contribute to the whole conversation. Let's don't forget the individual people who are going through this. It's not just a matter of charts and epidemiology reports. It's a matter of individuals who are really needy, who are going through a terrible time, who need our support, who need our prayers.
Body is like the body of Christ, and of course the Apostle Paul uses that illustration, and of course it is a great metaphor and very accurate as well. And we have to recognize that people within the body of Christ are suffering, and I'd love to get your thoughts about that, because having written a book on Where is God, Where It Hurts, and having written about Fearfully and Wonderfully Made with, of course, Dr. Paul Brand, what are your thoughts about how that fits and how the body of Christ right now can certainly be the hands and feet of Jesus in at least limited ways?
Yes. Well, one thing that strikes me is that Paul was pretty prophetic. He invented that phrase, as far as we know, the body of Christ, and he seemed to like it because he used it more than 24 times in the New Testament.
Right.
The fullest treatment is in 1 Corinthians 12. And I'm a writer, so I kind of like to look behind the scenes and imagine what the writers of the New Testament are going through. And I think Paul had a good day that day. I think he had a strong cup of coffee and a twinkle in his eye, and he just has fun with his metaphor, saying there are certain parts of the body that we pay so much attention to, like eyes. And I'm filling in here, but, some people dress up their eyes every day, make sure their eyelashes are straight, put on some mascara, put on a colored contact lens or something. We like eyes. They're important. And he said, you can actually get along fine without eyes, which is true. Think of Helen Keller, who couldn't see, couldn't hear, and yet she lived a very fulfilled life. But he says there are certain parts of the body that you can't get along without, and they're the ones that are unpresentable that we treat with special modesty. And I've asked doctors, what do you think he's talking about? And they say, well, the parts of the body you can't get along without, you will die if they shut down, are things like the colon and the bladder. If you stop excreting, you're going to die within a day or two. And isn't it interesting, in the current environment, of course the doctors are the heroes, but jet pilots are being laid off. People that we put at the top of the pecking order are being laid off. The real heroes are the orderlies in the hospitals who are cleaning bedpans and sterilizing furniture, and the nurses who are taking care of these bodies. They're the ones that we tend not to value. We don't pay them as much. Even school teachers. They're the heroes now. They're the ones trying to figure out, how can I communicate online? How can I keep this hospital safe? How can I instruct my patients and the people around me how to cope with this? It's kind of turned upside down. People aren't talking about hedge fund managers. They're all losing money, Mm-hmm. They're talking about janitors and people who are taking care. It's beautiful the way what Paul predicted, I think, when he was having that good day with a twinkle in his eye, is coming true right before our eyes.
Let's take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with Philip Yancey, but love to hear your comments if you would like to add any. You may just want to sit back and listen to our conversation, but I want to give you that chance to join the conversation today. 800-351-1212. And, of course, we have all sorts of information about Philip Yancey and his books, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. But let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The U.S. Constitution reminds us that the responsibility for our government rests with we the people. In order for us to be effective, we need to know something about our government and our history. Citizens in countries ruled by dictators don't need to know very much since the major decisions are made for them, but we Americans should be educated and informed. Unfortunately, we are not well educated and informed. A study done by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation discovered that only 1 in 3 Americans could actually pass the U.S. citizenship test, and I might add that you only have to get 60% of the questions right in order to pass the test. For example, a majority did not know how many justices serve on the Supreme Court. Nearly 3/4 could not accurately identify which states comprised the 13 colonies, and only a quarter even knew why the American colonists fought the British in the Revolutionary War. Most disturbing was the fact that young people perform worst on the test. You might excuse an elderly person for forgetting some facts about government or history, but less than 1 in 5 under the age of 45 could pass this test. In previous commentaries, I've proposed a solution that some states have considered. Require students to pass a citizenship test before they graduate from high school. Consider the fact that a naturalized citizen probably knows more about America's history and structure of government than someone who was born in this country. Young people in America cannot pass a citizenship test for one of 2 reasons. Either they weren't paying attention in class or they weren't taught this material in the first place. Let's require students to pass a citizenship test before graduation. We require it of people who want to be American citizens. Why not require it of students who are already citizens because they were born here? I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, many of you that receive an email from me received one yesterday where I said we have new heroes now. You know, if you were to ask who were heroes, you might think of a superhero, or you might have thought of an athlete or an actor or a musician. But I point out, of course, just as we talked about a minute ago with Philip Yancey, the healthcare workers, but I added some others to the list. How about those grocery store workers, as we talked about yesterday, some that have lost their lives, and that was not something they thought they were signing up for. Delivery drivers and so many other individuals. So again, we salute those of you that are first responders, and we mean that in more than just law enforcement and the medical profession, but many of you that are out there working, and we thank you for that as well. Philip Yancey with us, and I thought for just a minute I would go to your website. It's philipyancey.com, and mention a blog post that you posted. And you said, well, I sort of do it to myself. It's my own fault. I've written books like Where is God When It Hurts, Disappointment with God, The Question That Never Goes Away. And so your phone always rings when there's a mass shooting, when there's a hurricane, there's a tsunami, or where there's a pandemic. So talk about that for just a minute, because after all, there are all sorts of people that want to know what Philip Yancey has to say about some of these issues.
Yes, it's not necessarily a good thing to be known as the person who has a comment on pain, but a couple things I've learned, Kerby, that are worth repeating. And maybe the most important one I've learned is that God is on the side of the one who's suffering. It's almost intuitive, it's almost natural that when something bad happens, our first thought is, oh, I did something to deserve this. God is mad at me. But all you have to do is follow Jesus around in the New Testament to see how God feels about people who are suffering. Jesus never gives them a little sermon. He never blames them. He never philosophizes. He always responds with compassion, with comfort, and with healing. And we, as the body of Christ, Jesus is not here anymore in a physical body, but he is here in the body of Christ, in those who follow him. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to bring comfort and healing. And in a time of anxiety like this, I hope that the Christian community is playing exactly that role. There's a beautiful phrase in 2 Corinthians 1, which I'm sure you know. It talks about the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort. The comfort we have received from God, we're called to go and spread abroad. Boy, if there's ever a time in recent history, September 11 would be similar, I suppose, if there's ever a time when this nation needs comfort, needs a word of hope, it's now. I live in Colorado, and in the last election, we elected our very first Jewish governor. He's done a very good job. He's a cheerleader. He gives a press conference regularly, just like President Trump does as well. And I've been watching some of them and pretty impressed. The other day, our Jewish governor opened the Bible, turned to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 13, yes. And he said, let me read what the Apostle Paul said. And he said, 3 things remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And he went down each one of those. Faith. We need to have faith in our scientists, faith in our leaders, faith in those who are on the front lines. Hope. We have hope that we've been through crises like this before, and there are people working on it. And the curve is starting a little bit to slow down here. But he said the greatest of these is love. It'll only work. We can only pull together if we indeed do pull together and not apart, not blame each other. Look for ways in which we can help the neediest among us. And I thought, boy, that pretty well says it, doesn't it? Faith, hope, and love.
So good. I did not know that. Well, we're going to have to go find out more about him. Matter of fact, since you're talking about Jewish people a little bit later, I was going to maybe mention one of the things we talked about last hour with the column by Dennis Prager, who's been in studio with us, and also he quotes from Russ Doutet at New York Times about the whole worship of nature. But while we're talking about your piece for just a minute, I thought one of the most powerful paragraphs, in addition to the ones you just shared, was that you've probably studied, you said, every biblical passage relating to suffering, and you've concluded that there's really little guidance in the Bible about why. And I've come to the same conclusion. You know, the other day we had Sean McDowell on, and of course he more recently had done a forum where they talked about, why would God allow the coronavirus and everything else. But, Job's friends thought they had an answer, and they're kind of rebuked by God. The disciples thought they had an answer, and there's times when you just go, Jesus, you didn't answer the question. Why did that tower fall? Why was this kid's born blind? And he refutes their answer, but he doesn't really give them an answer. And I think that is striking because, again, as the guy that's known for writing about suffering and pain, you have come to the same conclusion I think most of us have, that that is just part of faith and hope and trusting that we just have to, in the midst of some of these circumstances, say that there may not be a readily available answer, at least on this earth, but maybe someday it will make sense to us.
Absolutely it will. In fact, my definition of faith is believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse.
Yes.
And I think the problem is we can only see things right in front of us. If there was ever a time when God had the platform to explain the why, it was in the book of Job. Because here was the most blameless, the most righteous man on earth who had done nothing wrong, and yet it looks like he's being punished the worst. And all of his friends are trying to convince him of that, but he knows, I didn't do it. And then God finally appears. It's the longest speech by God in the entire Bible, but he completely avoids the why question. If anybody had a right to know, it was Job. And an author I like a lot, Frederick Buechner, says, it's almost like God said, Job, trying to explain the universe to you would be like trying to explain Einstein to a little neck clam. But I'll tell you what I've been doing in running the universe while you've been down here whining. And whatever answer he gave, it was enough for Job, because he said, I repent in dust and ashes. I spoke of things I couldn't possibly understand. But what I've learned is we want to look backwards. We want to find out the cause. And the Bible emphasis, almost without exception, is looking forward. Okay, bad thing has happened. What are you going to do with it? Can you make anything good out of it? I think of God as the great recycler. He takes things that are junk, that we wish were not true, and somehow creates something good out of them. Jesus says that all the way through. Suffering is bad. If it wasn't bad, he wouldn't spend his time healing it and getting rid of it. But each time he said, now, what are you going to do with your life? The man born blind, okay, show that the works of God will be manifest in you. Sometimes that comes with healing, as it did for him. Sometimes it does not. For somebody like, say, Johnny Erickson Tata, who prayed for healing 1,000 times and never got it. But boy, what God has done, she has manifested the works of God as well as any person I've known who's had a miraculous healing.
That's incredible. You know, we've interviewed a number of times Dr. Rodney Stark. He's just down the road from where this studio is. And you quote his book, Rise of Christianity. I tend to quote his book, Triumph of Christianity. But they both basically say the same thing. And that is, if you want to understand why this so-called Jesus cult exploded, it was because Christians acted so differently than the rest of the culture. Because in the Roman world, if somebody's sick, you'd throw them out there on the streets. Well, the Christians, even to the threat of their own life, would go and provide food and water. And sometimes those people would be healed. Other times they would die and the Christian would die. They would be willing to go and die martyrs' deaths because they believed that. And the pagans were saying, we don't believe that stuff. And so how we as Christians react during this pandemic and show that we're anxious for nothing, but instead by prayer and supplication, we make our requests known to God or cast our anxieties on God because he cares for us. Those are some ways I think we can demonstrate the truthfulness of the gospel right now, don't you think?
Absolutely right. Imagine you're in Rome and a plague, bubonic plague, smallpox hits your town, and you want to get out of there. So it's hard, but you leave your family behind. You leave your mother, you leave your wife, you leave your children. I gotta take care of myself. And so you flee up into the hills and you survive. And then you come back and find out that the whole time you were up there getting away from danger, there were Christians coming into your house, wiping the sores, feeding, nourishing, and some of those Christians got sick and died. After a while, the Romans started saying, you know what, I like the way they live better than the way I live. I want what they've got. And we've seen that all throughout history. This Dr. Brand, it's clear that all of the great advances in treatment of leprosy came from Christians. Not because they were necessarily the best scientists and doctors, but they were the only ones willing to reach out to leprosy patients. And in every major city, you've got these biggest hospitals with names like Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic, you know. That's part of the trail that people have followed in Jesus' steps, saying this is one thing we can do. We can reach out to those who are suffering and help.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Philip Yancey for a little bit longer. But if you'd like to join us, maybe have a thought or comment, we would certainly entertain that, and we will come back and give you that opportunity, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to read a little bit more by Philip Yancey, and of course I have many of his books, including right here, the updated and combined edition of Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image, but all sorts of great books and also blog posts that we'll talk about. All that coming up right after this.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. And countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us, and heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Philip Yancey. And again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about him, you can simply go to his website, philipyancey.com, and you'll find some of the blog posts we've been talking about. And just for a moment, if nothing else, for my producer, Steve, who, of course, actually likes to, as an actor, go and participate in various Shakespearean plays, we both enjoyed the blog that you posted there that a number of years ago you read through all 38 of the plays by William Shakespeare, and it kind of brought back some memories because I do a Viewpoints commentary every day, and I dug some of those out, talking about some of the phrases from Shakespeare about catch a cold, or it's all Greek to me, you have a heart of gold, or all the others. And I had one on where we got so many of our English words from William Shakespeare. And so you just more recently here wrote about that as well, because in some respects, the English language that we take for granted today owes an incredible debt to William Shakespeare.
Yes, it does. And I forget the exact statistic, you may have it there, but something like 1 out of 6 words that he used, he only used a word one time.
Yes.
He didn't have a huge vocabulary, but it was a creative, innovative vocabulary. And then he was so good at it that the rest of us, other people, picked those up, and here we are 400, 500 years later still using that phrase that he came up with.
And I found so many times when I'll pass off a phrase, somebody will say something like love is blind. I say, well, that goes back to Merchant of Venice. And they go, really? Heart of gold. Well, that's, Henry V. They go, well, or then, of course, then they use a biblical phrase, prodigal, and they go, well, that's a biblical phrase. It is, because
right.
As my
Apple
viewpoints.
Yes.
It's just amazing. My commentary today is about historical literacy. Well, we can get into the whole issue of biblical literacy, but those of us that like to write, and of course you are the consummate writer, appreciate words, wordplay, and metaphors and illustrations. And if nothing else, I just thought I'd mention that because Steve has been in a couple of plays that have been Shakespeare plays, and we talk about it oftentimes at a break. So you rang our bell with that particular blog. But
that's great. I'm glad.
Yeah, let me come to one, though, and that is, as I mentioned, we're going to have Dr. Jim Dennison with us tomorrow. Usually he's in studio, but I'm sure he'll be by phone. But he quoted from Philip Yancey, who said, God goes where he's wanted. Now, this goes back a few years, so I don't expect you to remember all the details, but you were talking about how you've taken many of these international trips.
Right.
And when you have, you've noticed, in some respects, the variation of faith. I thought this was so creative, as always you are, like stages of marriage. Some people are in the honeymoon phase, some are in the divorced phase, some are in the mature marriage phase. But the point you are making is that as you travel around the world, and I've done some traveling, maybe not as much as you have, you see Christianity in various ways. And even the other day when I was talking to Gene Edward Veith, who's a Lutheran, I pointed out that, the most number of Lutherans are in Germany, but then number 2 is like Ethiopia, number 3 is Tanzania. You realize that in some respects, it's the Orthodox Lutherans in Africa that are trying to bring these liberal Lutherans back, and that's true about Anglicans and Episcopalians and everything else. And that's kind of interesting because we see different phases of faith around the world, don't we?
We do, and that first struck me when I was asked to speak on Y2K. on the exact day that we entered the new millennium. And so I flew up to Edmonton, Canada, and I was a little concerned because everybody was saying the planes are going to crash, the computers are going to stall, but it didn't happen, and I made it. I think I was the only one on the plane, but I had 3 flight attendants helping me. So I thought back over Christian history, and I've been to places like Turkey and Jordan, and almost every one of the centers of Christianity in the early days, the places where Paul wrote his letters, the places that the first couple chapters of Revelation refer to, letters to the churches. To get to those now, you have to hire an Islamic Muslim guide. There aren't any Christians left there.
I know.
And then it went to Rome, and then of course Europe was the seat of Christianity for more than 1,000 years. Visit Europe now; the cathedrals are still there, but about the only people you see in them, with some exceptions, are tourists with their video cameras. So then it jumped over to the New World, and the United States was certainly the font of the great mission movements, and we spread around the world. But as you know, every year the percentage of committed Christians gets smaller and smaller. Now the largest single, quote, religious group are nuns, people who have no religious affiliation. But boy, you go to places like Brazil, the Philippines, even the unregistered church in China, and the church is just thriving. And I was asking myself, why is this? It's like God moves, not just in the God moves kind of way, but picks up his bags and moves, from one place to another. Why? And the best explanation I could come up with was God goes where he's wanted. And that's scary for a place like the United States, because it tends to be countries that are doing well who say, I think I can do fine without God. It's the needy ones. It's the poor places. It's those who are under oppression who say, I need God. I need something more than this life. I need hope in an eternity. And I hope, frankly, that this coronavirus pandemic that we're going through is one of those times where we stop and realize we can get along without sports. Amazingly, who would have thought? We can get along without entertainment. I've watched some of the comedian shows, late night TV with Jimmy Fallon, and it's just not the same when they're sitting in their garage compared to the 1,000 people clapping at everything they say. It's a good time for us to take stock and realize what is most important, what kind of country do we want this to be, and invite God back in. God goes where he's wanted. He will return if his people return.
So well said. And again, if you think about this, we talk about the revivals in China that have taken place, and that may be even more of a Christian country someday, even though communist China still rules with an iron hand. And they say that in some respects, maybe this goes back to Joe Rosenberg and some of those, that the greatest revival we seem to be seeing right now is in a place like Iran, and it doesn't even have structural church buildings. We, over the years, have had an opportunity to try to provide for the Iranian Bible College. You go, there's a Bible college in Iran? Oh, no, it's in Turkey, but they smuggle them out, train them, and send them back in there. So in some respects, like you said, God goes where he's wanted, and maybe there is a time for a reevaluation. And more, as I've had a chance to talk to various individuals, even as we are doing these broadcasts, people tuning into Greg Laurie. Yesterday we had Lee Strobel. He was talking about the number of people that committed to Christ, they said, at least online, and the number at Greg Laurie's church, at Harvest, and all sorts of things that maybe suggest that we're in the midst of that. So we will see. But I love the illustration there that in some respects the gospel and Christianity seems to do better when it's a minority faith. It seems to, in some respects, grow in the midst of persecution. And that's really no surprise. We've seen that throughout the history of the church, haven't we?
We sure have. And that's one reason I don't get all that alarmed. Some people think, America used to be a Christian country, and now look, it's changing. Well, I grew up in the South, and there it was almost a cultural thing.
Yes.
You go to the grocery store, what church I'll go to, honey? They don't even know you, but they just assume you're a member of a church. That's what you do down there. Well, now that's not so true, and even less so in other parts of the country. You only go to church if you believe. And if you go back to the early church, they didn't really do evangelism. It was for committed believers, and you had to work your way in by going through discipleship just to attend a church. Very different than today, where we have these seeker services and we're trying to get people in. That's not the way it was in the early church, and we have something to learn from a committed minority, a truly committed minority who stands out from the rest of society can have more impact, like the early Christians did, than just kind of a general civility across the land where they operate on Christian principles, but they don't even know why.
Well, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk maybe a little bit about how this has changed everybody's view of nature, because Dennis Prager has written about this, and Ross Douthat and a number of others. But even as I was quoting from your piece here, sometimes what we actually export is not biblical Christianity. I love this one story where you talk about this very successful evangelical church in Spain where the pastor dresses in jeans, an untucked shirt, a rock band playing worship tunes. I mean, if nothing else, you understand what the core of the gospel is and what Christianity is. Sometimes when you travel outside of the United States, when you travel outside of Europe, you go to some of these small huts in Africa or Asia, and you really begin to understand that in a very significant way. So let's take a break, and we'll continue with Philip Yancey. And again, we've mentioned many of his books, but I would commend any of them to you. But certainly one that we chatted with him last time. He took the books and put them together in a combined edition, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, the marvel of bearing God's image, and of course some of the others that we've talked about, Where is God When It Hurts, and so many others that would be of great encouragement and help, even as right now we find ourselves dealing with some of these very important issues. And as Philip Yancey sometimes has his phone ring, because again, when you write those books, that's the first person they think to call. So we'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for just a few more minutes as we talk with Philip Yancey, and I thought we just might talk about nature for just a minute. And the reason I do that is I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, was born in Berkeley, and when I go to Colorado, where you live, it seems like home because you run into people that tend to worship nature. Now, there's nothing wrong with appreciating nature. I love to do nature photography and things like that, and both Christians and non-Christians, left and right, care about the environment. But I'm talking about this idea of environmentalism, and even the sort of the Gaia hypothesis that is taken over, where people sort of get excited about pantheism, or they are now we're hearing everybody saying, well, it's the science, and there is a sense in which nature becomes your God, science becomes your God. And if I think about this for just a minute, one of the things, Philip, that we see is if you go to Genesis, it tells us that we are to go out there and we are to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it or have dominion over, to be good stewards. And that is so antithetical to the way in which a lot of people in the environmental movement, they say, well, you shouldn't have children, number one, and you certainly shouldn't be ruling over nature. But this pandemic has sort of reminded us that, you know, nature can be beautiful, but it also can be brutal. Nature red in tooth and claw, people dying because of a pandemic. And I think maybe we've trusted too much in science and believed too much in the worship of nature. But what's your thoughts?
One of the most helpful insights I've ever received on nature came from G.K. Chesterton. He said, nature is not our mother, it's our sister. It's a parallel creation, and it's fallen just as we are. And that was so helpful to me. Living in Colorado, I'm not tempted to worship nature. I love nature, but I'll tell you why I'm not tempted. 2 weeks ago, there was a fresh deer kill right outside my house, and then it was dragged down into a gully. I turned on the light that night, and there were four mountain lions.
Whoa.
Chewing on that deer carcass. Now, I was behind a sliding glass door, but they were about 8 feet, 10 feet away. And I tell you, you're not tempted to worship when you watch what they do to an animal like a deer. I've climbed many of the mountains in Colorado. We have mountains over 14,000 feet, 14ers, and we like to kind of bag 14ers.
That's right.
And there's a saying that mountaineers use, that mountains aren't dangerous. They're just there. You know, they don't have feelings. They don't really care about you. I mean, they are dangerous if you don't climb them right, but it's so easy to project on nature things that really shouldn't be projected on nature. And if you understand nature as a beautiful, amazing, magnificent creation of God, just boundless creativity, but it's there as a fallen example. It's not the way God intended it to be. The red and tooth and claw part is not something that pleases God. And if you look at the prophets, God plans to fix it one day so that those lions will be lying down next to sheep, next to the deer, instead of gnawing on it. I don't know how all that's going to happen, but there's a clear indication that the way nature is not the way nature is supposed to be, and it's not the way nature is going to be. So if you worship it, you're worshiping a kind of a fallen idol, really.
And one of the things I think of is that in some respects right now, this is a place for Christians to maybe show that we do not have fear, because, you know, 2 Timothy says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control or sound mind, whatever translation you might have. And yet we've had a lot of fear that has been used when you relate it to nature. Talk about climate change, and immediately you can see some people's blood pressure go up, one because they're scared or others because they're angry about it, whatever. And, of course, this whole kind of fearful mindset that the world is ending in 12 years or those kinds of things is maybe even what is making it even more difficult for people to shelter in place, because they're already very fearful. There's a great deal of anxiety. And so, if nothing else, I think this is just a great opportunity for Christians to minister and to demonstrate that they view the world differently than those people who have no hope.
Yes, and I think that word you mentioned, stewardship, that's the key word. We don't want to despoil nature. We, above all, recognize that it's God's gift of art. It's God's great gift to us, and we are to take care of it. We're to flourish and help it flourish. and just wanton destruction of nature, like burning all the rainforest this year, for example, that's something that I'm upset about. I don't think that's taking care of what God gave us. We need to do it in a way that is best for the human race, for sure, but the best way to keep those resources going is to steward them properly.
I think if nothing else, Christians should be the best examples of stewards of creation. So that's just one more example of how to apply some of those principles. But just before we let you go, let's see if we can talk about what is available at your website, philipyancey.com, because I've quoted a couple times from some of the blogs, but you also have your books and writing and a variety of other things. So what will people find when they go to philipyancey.com?
One of the things I love about what's happening right now is that even though we're isolated, many places sheltered in place, locked down, we're connected like we've never been before. You mentioned Iran a few minutes ago, and I got an email letter from my Iranian translator telling me what it's like there, where you can't trust anything the government says. Everybody's wearing masks. There are many people dying, and yet the church is just thriving. What I love about the website is that I can put my thoughts about almost anything out there, and I get responses from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Chile, places, and I love that. So you'll find a description of each of my books. You'll find some articles that haven't been published anywhere else, but I just wanted to write about them, and then you'll find the blogs that I write just one a month. That's about all I do. I do Facebook posts more regularly than that, but a full blog is about one a month because I treat it like my articles. I grew up in the old school where I wrote polished articles, tried to make them as crafted as I could make them, not just spinning off something off the top of my head. So you'll find those there, whatever I've been thinking about lately, and my commentaries.
Yes, and again, I remember reading those in Christianity Today. And again, for you fellow writers out there, because we do a Christian Writers Conference, we're hoping it won't be canceled this July, but so far it's still on. I've got some material about a writer as an artist, a writer as a journalist, writer as psychotic. I love that. It was so good. Yes. As well as questions about writing and careers and things of that nature. So it'll really encourage you to use your gift of writing. And if any of us can approach even partially what Philip Yancey has done, I would think that would be considered a success. So always great to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby, and may God be with you as you continue to bring some comfort and take care of some of the fear and anxiety out there. I appreciate that.
We are going to take a break, and of course, you've already heard me mention that one of the guests that we will have tomorrow is Jim Dennison, who quoted from Philip Yancey, so that shows you that as well. And we'll get back into some of those issues. I did some research on the mask issue that some of you are asking about, and yes, indeed, it is kind of interesting to see some of these meta-studies that show that if you've got a mask, it's better than if you don't, and these masks are almost as good as an N95 respirator in some of these mass studies. So we'll talk about some of those issues a little bit later and give you some more updates on some of these models, some of the statistics, and even some of the concerns as we find ourselves in a very difficult set of circumstances. So if you found yourself saying, I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the aspects of what you've talked about today in terms of the coronavirus, that's on the website. If you'd like to learn more about evangelism, Jeff Jerina's articles and book is there as well. And of course, we have much material from Philip Yancey that we've posted, and I hope that will be an encouragement to you as well. So I hope you'll join us every single day here on Point of View. And just one last time, as we talked a little bit earlier with Warren Kelly, we certainly can still benefit from your financial investment. And if you'd like to do so, you can certainly go to the website and leave a donation as you find some of the articles we've mentioned. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We are surrounded by heroes, people willing to sacrifice for the good of others. We see it today in our hospitals with doctors and nurses putting themselves in harm's way to treat the victims of a worldwide pandemic. We see it in our civil servants still working on the front lines, protecting us. There are heroes in our grocery stores and pharmacies, welcoming us in, cleaning carts and doors. Don't look past them without saying thanks. and countless others keeping our computer networks running, driving trucks and vans, bringing our communities needed supplies. There are heroes all around us, and heroes right here listening. Last week, you stepped up in a big way to vote liberty over tyranny, to invest in truth. You became Truth Team members, and in our eyes, you're a hero. From all of us, thank you. You made a difference. And in case you missed out, you can still join us at pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being a hero.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing.